The silence in the boardroom was a weapon. It was polished, cold, and absolute, gleaming from the vast mahogany table and the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city from the 40th floor. This was the heart of the Aura retail empire, a place of power, and Margaret Shaw had always believed she belonged here. She sat with a practiced, patient smile, her posture immaculate. The two figures opposite her were unremarkable, a man and a woman in severe, dark suits. Auditors, she told herself. Bean counters. Let's begin, said the woman, her voice flat, devoid of any emotion. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. Her authority filled the room as she opened a thick, black binder. Margaret Shaw, the woman began, her eyes fixed on the page. You are the manager of store number 1, our flagship location. For 12 consecutive quarters, your store has exceeded profit projections by an average of 18%. Margaret's smile tightened, a flicker of pride in her eyes. I run a tight ship. The woman's gaze lifted from the page and met Margaret's. It was chillingly direct. The subsequent findings allege that your methods for achieving these results include, but are not limited to, systematic wage theft through falsified time cards, coercion of unpaid overtime, illegal garnishment of wages for store damages, and conspiracy to defraud the company via inventory manipulation. The list was delivered like a surgeon's diagnosis. Margaret's smile faltered, replaced by a slight, incredulous laugh. This is absurd. A few disgruntled employees, I'm sure. You know how it is. The woman did not react. She slid the open binder across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of Margaret. The page was a spreadsheet, meticulously detailed, cross-referencing security logins, payroll records, and sworn employee testimonies. Names, dates, amounts, down to the last cent. Her name was at the top, linked to dozens of transactions, each a small, cruel theft. The blood drained from Margaret's face. The smug confidence, her armor for decades, evaporated, revealing a raw, brittle panic. The room, once a symbol of her ambition, now felt like a pristine, inescapable cage. Her world wasn't just collapsing. It was being methodically dismantled before her very eyes. 3 weeks earlier, the man who called himself Marcus was an expert in invisibility. For 3 days, he had been a ghost haunting the polished aisles of Aura Retail's flagship store. He stocked shelves with a quiet efficiency that drew no attention, his movements precise and economical. He wore the standard employee uniform, a simple polo shirt and slacks, but his were worn just enough to suggest a life lived on a tight budget. He kept his head down, his expression neutral, becoming just another part of the store's complex machinery. And from this vantage point, he observed. He saw the fear. It was a low-frequency hum beneath the store's cheerful, piped-in music. He saw it in the way employees' shoulders tensed when the automatic glass doors to the manager's office slid open. He saw it in their hurried, whispered conversations in the stockroom, which ceased the second footsteps approached. This ecosystem of anxiety was the domain of Margaret Shaw. She didn't rule by shouting. Her methods were far more insidious. Team, she announced during the morning huddle, her voice a smooth, saccharine blade. She was scanning a sales report, not deigning to look at them. Let's have a productive day. And by productive, I mean a day where the displays look like they were arranged by professionals, not by distracted children. Maria, her eyes finally lifted, pinning a young woman near the back. The centerpiece in aisle 3 is a millimeter off-center. A millimeter. Do you understand what that communicates to our clientele? It communicates apathy. Fix it. There was no room for a response. Maria just nodded, her face flushed with shame, and scurried away. Marcus, arranging a pyramid of imported olive oil bottles nearby, didn't flinch. He simply registered the exchange. He cataloged the quiet sighs from other employees, the subtle rolling of eyes, the shared glance of resentment between two stock boys. He wasn't just observing a bad manager. He was diagnosing a sickness that had metastasized within the heart of his own company. Every passive-aggressive command, every humiliating barb, was a data point, and the data was telling him the problem was far worse than he had anticipated. There was a man who moved through the store like a gentle spirit, a constant presence for longer than almost anyone could remember. His name was Samuel Price. He was in his late 60s, with a slight stoop to his shoulders earned from 2 decades of pushing a mop and carrying the quiet burdens of the store. His hands were calloused, but his eyes held a soft, weary kindness. Samuel wasn't just a janitor. He was the store's living history, the keeper of its unspoken truths. Marcus first noticed him in the early morning, long before the doors opened to the public, buffing the floors with a focused, almost meditative rhythm. He saw the pride Samuel took in his work, the invisible smudges only he would notice, the corner of a shelf he'd wipe down simply because he was passing by. The confrontation happened in the back corridor, a stark, fluorescent-lit artery connecting the stockroom to the delivery bay. Marcus was organizing a shipment of cleaning supplies when Margaret appeared, her heels clicking an aggressive staccato on the concrete floor. Her eyes immediately landed on Samuel's janitorial cart. "Samuel," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. She picked up a spray bottle. "Tell me, what is the protocol for storing ammonia-based cleaners?" Samuel looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. They're on the bottom shelf, Miss Shaw. As required." "Are they?" She gestured to the bottle in her hand, which was, indeed, on the bottom shelf. "Because this one is a quarter turn to the left. The label isn't facing perfectly forward. It looks sloppy, haphazard." She paused, letting the triviality of her complaint hang in the air, magnifying its cruelty. After 20 years, Samuel, one would hope the simple things would become second nature. Or perhaps, we're starting to forget things. It was a devastatingly precise blow, aimed directly at his age and his dignity. Samuel's face, already etched with lines of fatigue, seemed to crumple. The light in his eyes dimmed. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply looked down at his own worn hands. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I'll fix it." From his position just inside the stockroom, Marcus watched, his body perfectly still. His jaw was a hard line of granite. He felt a cold, familiar anger crystallize in his chest. This wasn't just poor management. This was a calculated act of psychological erosion, a quiet violence perpetrated against the most vulnerable member of the staff. It wasn't just an incident. It was a symptom, and the diagnosis was wrought. The catalyst arrived with the sharp, sickening sound of shattering glass. It happened in aisle 7, the upscale wine section, where bottles priced higher than a week's groceries for most of the staff stood in silent, aristocratic rows. Samuel was carefully dusting the lower shelves, his movements slow and methodical. His hand, stiff with age, slipped for a fraction of a second. A bottle of vintage Bordeaux, priced at $400, tipped from its display, seemed to hang in the air for an impossible moment, and then crashed onto the immaculate tile floor. A dark red stain, glittering with shards of green glass, spread like a wound. The rich aroma of wasted luxury filled the air. For a few seconds, the entire aisle went silent. Shoppers and employees froze. Samuel stared at the puddle, his face ashen, his body rigid with shock. Margaret was there in an instant, drawn by the sound of financial loss. She didn't rush. She walked with a deliberate, predatory calm. She surveyed the scene, her eyes flicking from the broken bottle to Samuel's horrified face. A small, cruel smile played on her lips. She had an audience. "Well, Samuel," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's quite an expensive mess you've made. Miss Shaw, I am so sorry. My hand, it just—" He stammered, his voice trembling. "Your hand," she repeated, tasting the word with disdain. "For $100, Samuel. For $100 that could have gone to the company, to paying the salaries of competent employees." She leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial hiss, yet still audible to those nearby. "Don't you worry. We won't trouble you to pay for it all at once. We'll just deduct it from your paycheck. In installments. It should only take you, what, 3 or 4 months?" The finality in her tone was absolute. The color drained completely from Samuel's face. He looked at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and a gathering despair. The public humiliation, the years of quiet abuse, the constant weight of his age, it all culminated in that single moment. A tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. Then another. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, I can't. My wife's medicine. I won't be able to." His words dissolved into a choked sob. He covered his face with his hands, his stooped shoulders shaking. From the end of the aisle, Marcus watched the scene unfold. His face was a mask of placid neutrality, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He had seen enough. He stepped forward, his movements calm and purposeful. He stopped beside the puddle of wine, his presence a quiet interruption to Margaret's performance. "There's no need for that," he said, his voice low and even. "I'll pay for it." He reached for his wallet. Margaret spun around, her eyes blazing with fury. The challenge, coming from a lowly trainee, a non-entity, was a profound insult. He wasn't just undermining her authority, he was robbing her of her spectacle. "You'll do what?" she spat, her voice tight with rage. "Who do you think you are? You're a trainee, a nobody. You don't get to make decisions here." She took a step toward him, her personal space invasion a clear act of intimidation. "You're an arrogant little upstart, coming in here and thinking you know how things work." Then, she turned back to Samuel, who was still weeping silently. She made her final, fatal error. "And you," she pointed a finger at the old man, "are fired. You are a liability and a distraction. Get your things and get out." "You just had to create a dramatic scene, didn't you?" The aisle was dead silent, the air thick with the injustice of it all. Marcus slowly put his wallet back in his pocket. He looked at Margaret, his expression unreadable, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had everything he needed. Marcus held Margaret's furious gaze for a beat longer, his own expression a perfect blank canvas. There was no anger, no defiance. He simply absorbed her tirade. Then, he gave a slight, submissive dip of his head. "You're right," he said, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to her venom. "It was not my place. I apologized, Miss Shaw." His capitulation was so total, so immediate, that it momentarily disarmed her. She had expected an argument, a defense, something to fuel her righteous anger. Instead, she got quiet compliance. It fed her sense of absolute control. With a final, contemptuous sniff, she turned her back on him, dismissing him from her reality as easily as she had dismissed Samuel. Marcus turned and walked away, his pace unhurried. He didn't look back at the broken glass, at the humiliated old man, or at the victorious manager. He moved with the quiet purpose of a man who had already made his decision and was now merely executing the necessary steps. He disappeared into the stark functionality of the employee break room. The room was empty, smelling faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. He sat at a worn laminate table, his back to the door. He reached into his pocket and bypassed the sleek, top-of-the-line smartphone he used for his public life as Julian Vance. Instead, his fingers closed around a second device, a small, featureless, and utterly untraceable burner phone. He powered it on. The screen glowed with a simple, text-only interface. There was only one contact saved, a number without a name. He composed a new message, his thumbs moving with practiced speed. The text was precise, clinical, and stripped of all emotion. It was a command. Activate Guardian Protocol. Target, Store Number 1. Initiator, Samuel Price. He read the message once, then hit send. A single checkmark appeared. Delivered. He powered the phone down, slipped it back into his pocket, and stood up. He took a deep, steadying breath. To anyone watching, he was just Marcus, the trainee, taking a moment to recover from a public dressing down. But in the silent, encrypted world of corporate oversight, a signal had been received. An elite, independent unit, created for this exact purpose, had just been deployed. The invisible war had begun. Margaret Shaw had no idea. 2 days passed. The incident in aisle 7 was memory, scrubbed from the floor and absorbed into the store's silent, collective trauma. Samuel Price was gone, his 2 decades of service erased without a mention. The low hum of fear beneath the music returned to its normal frequency. For Margaret Shaw, it was business as usual. For Marcus, it was the quiet before the storm. The storm arrived at 10:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, in the form of a man and a woman who did not look like shoppers. They wore severe, dark gray suits that seemed to absorb the store's cheerful lighting. They moved with an unnerving synchronicity, their eyes scanning not the merchandise, but the infrastructure, the camera domes, the employee workstations, the exits. They walked directly to Margaret's glass-walled office and entered without knocking. Margaret looked up from her computer, her face a mask of polite annoyance at the intrusion. The woman was in her late 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. She placed a business card on Margaret's desk without a word. It read, Elena Rostov, Lead Investigator, Corporate Office of Ethics and Oversight. Ms. Shaw. Elena began, her voice as flat and neutral as a dial tone. We are here to conduct a full-spectrum operational audit. This is a routine, though unscheduled, review. Margaret's practiced smile snapped into place. An audit. A headache, a bureaucratic hoop to jump through, but nothing more. Of course, she said, her tone oozing cooperation. We have nothing to hide. I wish you'd called ahead. I would have prepared a welcome packet. Can I get you some coffee? That won't be necessary, Elena said, her eyes impassive. What we will require is a secure, private room with network access. We will also need immediate, unrestricted access to all payroll records, timecard logs, inventory adjustment reports, and employee disciplinary files for the past 36 months. The sheer scope of the request was staggering. Not the last quarter, not the last year, but 3 full years. A flicker of something, annoyance, caution, crossed Margaret's face, but her arrogance snuffed it out. They were auditors. They were paid to be excessively thorough. Whatever you need, she said with a magnanimous wave of her hand. My house is your house. She escorted them to a small, windowless office used for inventory counts, feeling a sense of smug satisfaction. Let the bean counters have their fun. They would find nothing but impeccable profit margins and ruthless efficiency. From the sales floor, Marcus watched as Elena and her associate set up their laptops and a portable document scanner. They worked in a focused, unnerving silence, transforming the drab office into a clinical command center. Margaret walked past them, giving the other employees a conspiratorial eye roll, a silent signal that this was all just a tedious waste of time. She had no idea she was looking at her own executioners. She couldn't comprehend that the quiet, efficient machine being assembled in that little room was the hidden mechanism of the company's justice, a system she didn't even know existed. And it had been aimed directly at her. Elena Rostov began with the precision of a surgeon dissecting a tumor. Her team's first official request was for the complete file on the termination of Samuel Price. Within the hour, Margaret delivered a pristine manila folder. It was a masterclass in corporate fiction. The file contained 3 separate disciplinary write-ups for Samuel, all dated within the last 6 months, citing negligence, failure to follow safety protocols, and insubordination. The final document was a termination report detailing the wine bottle incident, framing it as the culmination of a pattern of declining performance. It was signed by Margaret and, crucially, countersigned with a shaky, forged signature purporting to be Samuel's. Margaret presented it with an air of weary diligence. It was a sad situation, she sighed. We gave him so many chances. But his performance had become a liability. A real shame. Elena took the file, her expression unreadable. She didn't comment. She simply thanked Margaret and closed her office door. Inside, she and her partner examined the documents under a portable high-intensity lamp. The ink on all 3 write-up signatures is identical in pressure and fading, her associate noted, pointing with the tip of a pen. They were signed on the same day, with the same pen. Not over a period of 6 months. Elena nodded, her eyes cold. Pull his time cards. Cross-reference them with the security footage logs for the dates of these supposed counseling sessions. This was the first thread they pulled. And as they pulled, the entire tapestry of Margaret's management began to unravel. They sat in their windowless room for hours, a silent vortex of data analysis in the middle of the bustling store. The discrepancies started as trickles, then became a flood. Time cards showed employees clocking out at 10 p.m., while security logs showed them leaving the building well after midnight. Payroll records indicated deductions for uniform maintenance and cash drawer shortages that had no corresponding company policy. Inventory reports showed consistent write-offs for damaged goods that conveniently aligned with months where sales targets were barely missed. From the sales floor, Marcus watched Margaret grow increasingly agitated. Her initial confidence was curdling into a prickly defensiveness. She patrolled the aisles more aggressively, her comments to the staff sharper and more frequent. She was trying to reassert her dominance, unaware that the foundation of her power was being systematically hollowed out just a few feet away. Late in the afternoon, Elena requested a master key to the store's locked file cabinets. Margaret's smile became a taut line. Is that really necessary? Most of that is archived. The audit is full spectrum, Miss Shaw. Elena replied, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Reluctantly, Margaret handed over the key. As Elena walked away, Marcus saw Margaret's hand tremble, just for a second, as she reached for her phone. She was no longer just annoyed. She was becoming concerned. The auditors were not just counting beans, they were digging for bones. And she knew exactly where they were buried. The paper trail was a skeleton. Now, Elena Rostov needed to give it flesh and a voice. Financial malpractice was a fireable offense, but what she was building was a case for something more profound, a systematic pattern of abuse that had been allowed to fester for years. For that, she needed the testimony of the victims. Her team began with the current staff. One by one, employees were called into the small, sterile office. The door would close, and Marcus, stocking shelves in a nearby aisle, could almost feel the oppressive weight of the silence. The initial results were an exercise in futility. The employees were terrified. Their answers were short, clipped, and noncommittal. How would you describe the management style in this store? Elena would ask, her tone gentle, inviting confidence. Efficient, a young woman from the cosmetics counter would murmur, her eyes fixed on her own hands. Ms. Shaw runs a tight ship. Have you ever been asked to work past your scheduled shift without compensation? A pause. A flicker of something in the stock boy's eyes. Fear, resentment, before it was extinguished. Not that I recall. They were protecting themselves. Margaret's office was a glass cage, and she watched every employee who entered and left the audit room. Her gaze was a physical weight, a reminder of who held the immediate power over their lives. Elena understood. The fear was a more powerful motivator than the vague promise of corporate justice. So she changed tactics. Her team began working through the night, cross-referencing the list of terminated employees from the past 3 years with their last known contact information. They were hunting for ghosts, people who were no longer under Margaret's direct control. Her first breakthrough came from a man named David Chun, a former assistant manager fired 18 months prior for gross incompetence. The official report, signed by Margaret, detailed how he had mismanaged an inventory count, costing the company thousands. Elena met him not at the store, but in a quiet, anonymous coffee shop halfway across the city. David was a shadow of the ambitious young man his file photo suggested. He was nervous, bitter, and radiated an aura of defeated potential. I don't know what I can tell you, he said, stirring his coffee so intensely it threatened to slop over the sides. It's all in the file. I screwed up. Elena slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was the security log for the night of the mismanaged inventory count. The log shows you clocked out at 2 a.m., she said calmly. But the inventory submission to corporate was timestamped at 4:37 a.m. from Margaret Shaw's personal laptop, logged in from her home address. The final numbers were altered after you left the building. David stared at the paper. His stirring stopped. He looked up at Elena, his eyes wide, a storm of anger and vindication brewing within them. For 18 months, he had carried the weight of a failure that wasn't his. She told me I was useless, he whispered, the words thick with remembered pain. She said I was lucky she wasn't pressing charges for theft. She needed a scapegoat, Elena stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Tell me what really happened, Mr. Chun. We can't change the past, but we can ensure the official record reflects the truth. We are fully prepared to offer you legal protection against any potential retaliation. That was all it took. The promise of protection, backed by undeniable proof, broke the dam. David began to talk, and the story of Margaret's reign of terror poured out. He spoke of the humiliation meetings, where she would single out an employee for a minor error and berate them in front of the entire staff. He explained how she manipulated the schedule, adding extra hours at the last minute and classifying them as shift adjustments rather than overtime. He gave her names, a dozen other employees, both current and former, who had been cheated, bullied, and broken. Armed with David's testimony, Elena's team had a key. They could now ask specific, targeted questions. They brought the young woman from the cosmetics counter back in. We have a sworn statement regarding an incident on June 12th of last year, Elena said, her voice still calm, but now with an edge of irrefutable authority. It alleges that a cash drawer shortage of $50 was deducted directly from the paychecks of 3 employees on that shift, including you. Is that correct? The woman's carefully constructed wall crumbled. She looked at Elena, then at the closed door, and finally, she broke. In a flood of tears and hushed, fearful whispers, she confirmed everything. The ghosts were beginning to speak, and their collective voice was becoming a roar that was about to bring Margaret Shaw's world crashing down around her. Elena Rostov was a student of patterns. After days immersed in the store's data, one pattern screamed louder than any other: the sheer, unmitigated audacity of it all. Margaret Shaw's transgressions weren't subtle. They were brazen, repeated over years, and documented, albeit with falsified justifications, in the company's own systems. A manager this reckless could only operate with one of 2 beliefs: that she was smarter than everyone else, or that she knew she was protected. Elena bet on the latter. Who is her direct superior? She asked her associate, her eyes not leaving the spreadsheet of terminated employees on her screen. Regional Manager, Robert Henderson. Pull all communications between this store and Henderson's office for the last 3 years. Emails, official reviews, expense reports. Everything. The request was an escalation, moving the investigation beyond the 4 walls of the store and into the regional hierarchy. As the data flowed in, another pattern began to emerge. Henderson's performance reviews of Margaret were glowing, filled with corporate buzzwords like uncompromising, results-oriented, and effective. He consistently rated her exceeds expectations, even during quarters where employee turnover was mysteriously high. There were no red flags. There were no flags at all. It was a pristine, perfect record. Too perfect. The key came, as it so often did, from the ghost of David Chun. Buried deep in the digital HR archives, they found it. A formal complaint filed by David 2 weeks before his termination. It was a detailed, professional, and damning account of Margaret's wage theft practices and her use of intimidation. The complaint had been electronically flagged as escalated to regional management. Elena's team immediately cross-referenced that date with the email servers. It took them 3 hours of meticulous searching, but they found the chain. The first email was from David Chun to Robert Henderson, a desperate, final plea for intervention. The second was Henderson's reply to David, sent 2 hours later, a single, dismissive line. "Thank you for your feedback. We will look into this matter." But there was a third email, sent by Henderson just 60 seconds after he had replied to David. It was forwarded directly to Margaret Shaw. Henderson had attached David's original complaint and added his own 2-line comment at the top. "Another one for your fan club. Keep the numbers up. I'll handle the noise." Elena stared at the screen, her expression as cold and hard as frozen steel. This was the smoking gun. This was the proof of the shield wall that had protected Margaret all these years. It wasn't just negligence on Henderson's part. It was active, cynical collusion. Her associate pulled up Henderson's compensation records. The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Henderson's annual bonus was directly tied to the profitability of the stores in his region. For 12 consecutive quarters, Margaret's store had been the top performer, the jewel in his crown. Her manufactured profits had been padding his pockets, year after year. He wasn't just ignoring the abuse, he was profiting from it. Elena picked up her phone. The scope of the investigation had just doubled. She was no longer just removing a corrupt store manager. She was now preparing to decapitate the regional leadership. The local system of rot was now fully exposed. While Elena's team hunted ghosts in the archives, Marcus continued his life as one on the sales floor. He became part of the scenery, a quiet, diligent worker who saw everything and was seen by no one. The store's atmosphere had grown thick and suffocating. The initial pretense of a routine audit had evaporated, replaced by a silent, high-stakes siege. Employees moved with a nervous, twitchy energy, their eyes constantly darting towards the glass-walled office of their manager and the closed door of the impromptu investigation room. Margaret, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet, had escalated her campaign of quiet terror. She couldn't openly threaten her staff, not with the auditors watching. Instead, she mastered the art of the veiled warning, the drive-by intimidation. Marcus witnessed it firsthand in aisle 4. Margaret cornered Maria, the young woman she had humiliated over the display centerpiece days earlier. She put a hand on Maria's shoulder, a gesture that looked supportive from a distance, but was a vice grip up close. "Maria," Margaret said, her voice a low, confidential purr. "These corporate people, they can be very confusing. They twist things. Just remember who signs your paycheck. Remember who approved your time off last month when your mother was sick. Loyalty is so important. It's what makes us a family here." She squeezed Maria's shoulder one last time before gliding away, leaving the young woman pale and trembling. It was a masterpiece of coercion, a reminder of past favors and a threat of future consequences, all delivered with a predatory smile. Marcus, pretending to be absorbed in arranging a display of pasta sauce, felt a cold, clear resolve settle over him. It was time to intervene, not as a trainee, but as the invisible hand guiding the investigation. Later, during his break, he found a deserted corner of the cavernous stockroom. He pulled out the burner phone. His fingers flew across the keypad, composing a new message to the same encrypted number. It was not a general tip. It was a surgical strike. Source of illegal wage deductions is not on payroll. Check store's discretionary Sunshine Fund account. M. Shaw uses it as a personal slush fund, forcing employees to donate for office parties and then using it to cover cash shortages and personal expenses. Cross-ref with testimony from Sarah Jenkins. Fired August last year. Official reason, tardiness. Real reason, refused to cater Shaw's private party off the books. He hit send. Inside the audit room, Elena Rostov's phone buzzed silently on the table. She glanced at the screen. A new message from her anonymous advisor. As she read, her expression remained neutral, but a flicker of grim satisfaction ignited in her eyes. "Pull the Sunshine Fund ledger," she said to her associate, her voice clipped. "And find me a contact number for a Sarah Jenkins." The tip was a bombshell. This Sunshine Fund was a small, off-the-books cash account that every store manager had, intended for minor employee morale events like birthday cakes or get-well cards. It was a black hole in the corporate accounting, too small to be officially audited. It was the perfect place to hide 1,000 small sins. When they finally reached Sarah Jenkins, a single mother now working 2 jobs to make ends meet, she was hesitant at first. But when Elena mentioned the Sunshine Fund, the woman's voice turned to steel. She confirmed everything. She recounted, in humiliating detail, how Margaret had volunteered her to work as a server at a private garden party at her home, and when she had refused, she was fired a week later for being 3 minutes late to a shift. Elena hung up the phone. Her case was no longer just about corporate fraud and employee abuse. It was now about personal extortion. She looked at the latest anonymous text on her phone. She didn't know who this source was, a disgruntled former manager, a current employee who had finally found their courage, but their information was flawless. They were feeding her a perfect trail of breadcrumbs, leading her directly through the darkest parts of Margaret's labyrinth. The net wasn't just tightening. It was being expertly drawn shut by an unseen strategist. The call came on a Friday morning, a week after the auditor's arrival. It wasn't Elena Rostov who made the call, but an impeccably polite executive assistant from the 40th floor. Margaret Shaw and Robert Henderson were cordially invited to headquarters for a meeting to discuss the preliminary findings of the store number 1 audit and strategize next steps. The wording was a masterpiece of corporate euphemism. It was a summons disguised as a collaboration. In his plush regional office 50 miles away, Robert Henderson leaned back in his leather chair, the phone cradled on his shoulder, and smiled. "Finally," he said to Margaret over the phone. "The propeller heads are done playing with their spreadsheets. Don't you worry about a thing, Maggie. Let me do the talking. I'll frame this as a necessary, if aggressive, management style required for a flagship location. We'll paint the complainers as a few low-performing malcontents. We'll be in and out in an hour." His confidence was absolute, a fortress built on years of successfully navigating corporate politics. He saw the situation not as a threat, but as a tedious HR issue that required his deft touch to manage. He had handled noise like this before. Margaret, driving to the city, felt her own anxiety melt away under the warmth of his assurance. He was right. Henderson was a regional manager, a suit from the upper echelons. These auditors were just fact-finders. They had no real power. The final decision would be made by men like Henderson, men who understood that profits were more important than the feelings of a few replaceable employees. The system, the one that had protected her for so long, would hold. The thought that this audit was part of a different, higher system never even entered her mind. She walked into the gleaming lobby of the Aura retail tower with her head held high, a vision of composed authority in her sharpest business attire. She met Henderson by the elevators. He gave her a reassuring wink. "Showtime," he murmured, straightening his silk tie. "Just follow my lead. We're a team. We'll present a united front." As the elevator ascended with silent, breathtaking speed, Margaret felt a familiar thrill. This was where she belonged. The rarefied air of power, the panoramic views of the city spreading out below. This was her world. The grimy break room, the weeping old janitor, the resentful glances from her underpaid staff. All of that was a distant, insignificant part of the machinery that had propelled her to this very moment. They stepped out onto the 40th floor. The silence was pristine, the air cool and still. The executive assistant, a young woman with a polite but unreadable smile, greeted them. "Ms. Shaw, Mr. Henderson, thank you for coming. They're ready for you in the main boardroom." She led them down a long, art-lined corridor to a set of imposing double doors. She opened one and gestured for them to enter. As they stepped across the threshold, their confident smiles frozen on their faces, the door clicked shut behind them with a soft, final thud. The boardroom was a tomb, and Margaret and Henderson were the freshly interred. They sat opposite Elena Rostov and her silent male colleague, the vast, polished table between them a chasm. The scene was a near-perfect echo of the prologue, but now, the context was terrifyingly clear. "Thank you both for coming," Elena began, her voice devoid of any warmth. She slid two thick, black binders to the center of the table. One was labeled Shaw, M. The other, Henderson, R. "As we stated, this meeting is to review the findings of our audit." Henderson leaned forward, his politician's smile firmly in place. "Elena, I'm sure this has been a thorough exercise, but I think we can agree that Margaret runs the most profitable store in my region." "Mr. Henderson," Elena interrupted, her voice cutting through his condescension like glass. "We are not here to discuss profits. We are here to discuss the cost." She opened her own binder. "Let's begin with the termination of Samuel Price. Ms. Shaw, you provided us with a file containing 3 disciplinary write-ups, justifying his dismissal." She slid copies across the table. "Our forensic analysis confirms these documents were all signed on the same day, with the same pen, likely within minutes of each other. Furthermore, security logs show that on the dates of 2 of the alleged counseling sessions, Mr. Price had already clocked out and left the building. This is not a personnel file. It is a work of fiction." Margaret's face tightened, but she said nothing. "Let's move on to wage theft," Elena continued, her tone relentless. "We have sworn testimony, corroborated by financial records from a secret account known as the Sunshine Fund, that you, Ms. Shaw, systematically extorted employees to cover cash shortages. We have a statement from a Sarah Jenkins, whom you fired after she refused to work unpaid as a servant at your private residence." Henderson's smile was gone, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed expression. He shot a venomous glare at Margaret. Elena then turned her icy gaze directly on him. "Which brings us to you, Mr. Henderson. We have documentation of 17 separate HR complaints filed against Ms. Shaw from various employees over the past 3 years. All of them were escalated to your office. All of them were dismissed without investigation. I have a large region to manage," Henderson blustered, his voice suddenly thin. "I trusted my manager on the ground. Did you trust her, or did you enable her?" Elena countered, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She slid a final piece of paper across the table. It was a printout of an email. "This is an email you sent to Ms. Shaw 2 weeks before you approved the termination of Assistant Manager David Chun. It is a forward of Mr. Chin's formal complaint against her. Your attached comment reads, 'Another one for your fan club. Keep the numbers up. I'll handle the noise.'" The silence that followed was absolute. The words hung in the air, an indictment from which there was no escape. Henderson stared at the email, his face the color of ash. His entire defense, his career, his reputation, all incinerated by a few casually typed words. Margaret, however, was not a politician. She was a bully. And when a bully is cornered, they don't fold. They lash out. "This is ridiculous," she snarled, slamming her hand on the table. She stood up, her face a mask of furious indignation. This entire thing is a sham. A witch hunt based on the whining of a few lazy, incompetent employees who couldn't handle the pressure of a high-performance environment. They're liars. All of them. Her voice echoed in the silent, cavernous room. She was wild, defiant, utterly convinced of her own righteousness. And in the middle of her tirade, the boardroom door clicked open. A man stepped into the room. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that spoke of quiet, immense wealth. He moved with an unhurried grace, his presence instantly commanding the space. His face was calm, his expression thoughtful. It was the face of the man who had called himself Marcus. He walked calmly to the head of the table and stood beside Elena Rostov, who gave him a brief, respectful nod. He surveyed the scene. The binders, the damning email, Henderson's shattered composure, and Margaret, frozen mid-rant, her mouth still agape. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Julian Vance looked directly at Margaret. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but it filled every corner of the room. It was the same low, even tone she had heard in aisle 7. You had something to say about the trainee, Marcus, Margaret? The question was a key, unlocking a series of horrifying realizations in Margaret's mind. A cascade of images flooded her consciousness. The quiet trainee stocking shelves, his eyes missing nothing. The man who had witnessed her humiliate Samuel over a spray bottle. The nobody who had offered to pay for the wine, whose quiet defiance had so enraged her. The silent observer who had been there when she threatened Maria. The blood drained from her face, leaving a mottled, waxy pallor. Her fury collapsed, imploding into a black hole of pure, undiluted horror. This wasn't an audit. This was a personal judgment. The man she had dismissed, mocked, and verbally abused wasn't just a witness to her crimes. He was the judge. Her legs gave way, and she sank back into her chair, her body suddenly devoid of strength. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The absolute power she had wielded, the entire world she had built on a foundation of fear and arrogance, had been a sandcastle. And the man she had never even seen as a threat was the tide that had just washed it all away. The aftermath was swift and total. Margaret Shaw and Robert Henderson were terminated, effective immediately. They were escorted from the building by security, their corporate identities and all the power that came with them erased before they reached the ground floor. The contents of Elena Rostov's binders were compiled and handed over to the company's legal counsel, with instructions to forward the entire investigation to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. The next day, Julian Vance drove to a small, neat house in a quiet suburb. He knocked on the door, and it was opened by Samuel Price. The old man's eyes widened in recognition, a flicker of fear and confusion in them. "Marcus," he asked, his voice hesitant. "My name is Julian Vance, Mr. Price," he said gently, "and I am here, on behalf of my entire company, to offer you my most profound and sincere apology." Over a cup of tea in Samuel's humble living room, Julian explained everything. He didn't make excuses. He took full responsibility for the systemic failure that had allowed a manager like Margaret to thrive. He then slid an envelope across the table. It contained a check for full back pay, plus a second, substantial check as compensation for the distress and humiliation he had endured. "But that is not enough," Julian said. "Your dedication to this company, your eye for detail, it's a resource we have wasted. I am creating a new position, effective immediately, District Quality Supervisor. You would report directly to my office, responsible for visiting stores to ensure that standards of maintenance, cleanliness, and, most importantly, employee respect are being met. You would be the guardian, Samuel. The eyes and ears that ensure what happened to you never happens to anyone else." Tears welled in Samuel's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a quiet, overwhelming vindication. His dignity, stolen from him on a cold tile floor, had been returned to him 100-fold. A week later, a mandatory all-hands video conference was broadcast to every Aura retail employee, from the executive suites to the part-time stockers. Julian Vance appeared on the screen. He was direct. He told them about the rot discovered in store number 1, calling it a cancer of cruelty. He announced the immediate termination of the manager and regional manager involved. "Today," he concluded, his gaze firm and unwavering, "we are making a change. The Guardian Protocol will no longer be a secret failsafe. It is now the permanent, fully funded Office of Employee Advocacy. We are launching a new, truly anonymous hotline, managed by an independent third party, for reporting any and all abuses of power. I am making a promise to each and every one of you. Your dignity is not a negotiable line item. It is the bedrock of this company. The final shot of the video was not of the CEO in his office, but of Samuel Price, standing in aisle 7 of his old store. He wore a new, crisp supervisor's uniform. He wasn't pushing a mop. He was speaking quietly with a young trainee, a kind hand on her shoulder, pointing out a detail with a gentle, knowing smile. The system had not only been purged, it had been healed. Justice, true and deep, had finally been stocked on the shelves.